We had gotten down to verse 23. I titled this section, verses 23 through 29, God's Judgment Produces Fruit. So in verse 23, he says, "Give ye ear, and hear my voice. Hearken, and hear my speech." In this, there's 4 imperatives that Isaiah uses. An imperative is very simply a command. He is commanding. And he uses these imperatives to draw special attention for the people to hear what he has to say. Pulpit commentary puts it that a preface of this kind enjoining special attention and thought was appropriate to occasions when instruction was couched in parabolic form, end quote. And so what follows is a parable that is important, and these imperatives lets everyone know this is something that needs to be hearkened to, that needs to be heard, and in a sense obeyed. Let him hear. That would be a good illustration of this same principle. Here's something that's important. Have you ever noticed how many times the scripture says something along the lines, knowing this first? Is that the first thing that you need to learn? No. It's just saying, here is something that is of great importance. It's not first in numerical order, it's first in regards to something that is of great importance, something that's vital to understand. That's kind of like this in Isaiah using 4 commands or imperatives: give, hear, hearken, hear. That's pretty repetitive in a sense, but he's drawing attention to it. This parable that he's going to use is from agriculture, and it's to teach Yahweh's judgments always have a purpose. And that he acts according to his divine wisdom. Some methods may seem harsher than others, but it always brings about his purpose, dealing with specifically his redemptive purpose. We understand in raising children, punishments that we dish out to those children comes in various forms and severity. Some things are pretty severe and they might get a good hard paddling or belt used. Others, a good talking to. It varies depending on the action and the severity that's needed for that time. Well, that's what we see in this as well. I think it's kind of strange. Probably any parable dealing with agriculture, I'm probably one of the worst to speak about it. I think I tilled up one little plot of ground in my life. I didn't plant anything. I didn't do any work in it other than doing, we borrowed a tiller and I tilled it. I don't like it. I'll admit. It's not, as we would put it, it's not my cup of tea. So I basically am taking what others say about things when it deals with this. But in verse 24, doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Doth he open and break the clods of his ground? Basically, he's asking, the farmer does not plow all day without ever intention of sowing. That process of plowing does not go on forever. Can you imagine someone, a farmer who's wanting to make money out of his farm, and you see him get out and he starts plowing the first day, and he plows the second day, and he keeps plowing day after day after day after day, and he never does anything but plow? That's basically the figure that is being used. He never sows anything, never sows any seed. Well, that would be kind of foolish. Well, the plowman does not plow all day and simply open the ground. There's other things that must be done. There's the sowing and all of this other stuff. I say I'm the world's worst to speak about it, but so that he can sow the seed.
I don't know what those pictures are. I looked that up. That says skunks. I have no idea what that is.
We'll get to that one. There is an object, though, to his plowing. It is to sow the seed. And so when the ground's properly prepared, what does he do? He then sows the seed. The figure is being used that God deals with his children in various ways. God might chastise his children severely, whereas at another time he might not chastise them as severe to obtain the results that he desires. Someone turn over to Job chapter 5 and verse 17 and read that for us.
Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth, therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty.
Okay, a good principle here. That God does this. He corrects us. He chastens us. So what? Don't despise it. We should be blessed, or we are blessed by his chastening. Someone read Psalm 94 and verse 12. Psalm 94:12.
Blessed is the man whom thou chastenest, O Lord, and teachest him out of thy law.
Okay. Again, the idea of being blessed by receiving the Lord's chastening. Here, though, he adds, teacheth him out of thy law. Mm-hmm. Same way. I put down Hebrews 5:12, but I think I meant Hebrews 12:5. Yes.
And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him.
Okay. And he uses the parents in relationship to teaching their children in Hebrews 12. And if we go on to read verse 6, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. God is, through that chastening, to use Paul's illustration of a parent molding their child to be what they need to be. Well, God's doing that in relationship to us as his children. He's dealing with us as a father would his child. And that's what verse 7 goes on to emphasize. If you endure chastening, God dealeth with you as sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? And if you skip down to verse 10, after he uses the illustration of a father and a son, for they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. He chastens us for our profit, so we would be holy. God chastening us. There is a purpose to it, an intent. But does the Lord just continue to chasten and continue to chasten and continue to chasten? Would a father just continue to chasten his son? No. Well, we're talking about constantly, all the time. That's all he does. Parent's not going to do that. It would not be profitable for the child. He would grow up, and that's certainly would Ephesians 6 and verse 4, ye fathers provoke not your children to wrath. That would be provoking them to wrath, wouldn't it? They would just become angry, hateful. There's the need for it, but then you stop. And there's the encouragement. There's other aspects in which we are training them, teaching them. Well, God's chastening would be the same way. When the chastening is accomplished, he stops the chastening. How does God chasten us today? No answers? Well, through his providence, that would be true. But in reality, we don't know. Anytime we have a severe hurricane come through, what do we normally hear? God's punishing somebody. How do you know that? Now then, has God used those type of things to punish people? Absolutely. He did. But to say any specific event is God's chastening, you can't do that, even in your own life. It's much like the area of providence. Now, Paul is an inspired writer of the New Testament, and here he comes along and writing about Onesimus to Philemon, and he says, he uses an interesting word, perhaps. And it's dealing with, perhaps he ran away from you, and it was in reality for good. He became a Christian, and so this might be the providence of God that he ran away. But as an inspired writer, he would not even say, this is that. He uses the perhaps word. It could be, but we don't know for certain.
God would have told him if it was for certain, he would have said it was for certain. He did.
That's the whole point. He didn't say that. He didn't say it was for certain. He didn't know. And so he left it in the realm of possibility. Maybe he even thought probability, but not certainty. There's a lot of things that could be taking place in our country through nature and natural events, through a lot of areas in which God is trying to use those things to chasten us or this country or people. But to say that it is, no, we don't have the right to say that. We don't know. Well, that would be the whole point. But it might be. It could be. I might think it's a probability, but even then we can't say for certainty. I can look back at things in my life. I believe that the providence of God was at work in those things. Can I say for certain that that's the truth? No. Same thing with you in your life. You can look back on things and say, this is providence of God. At least I believe that it is. We know that God works that way. God also works in the area of chastening the same way. And we might think that this might be the chastening of the Lord. We might even think it's a probability, but we don't know for certain.
Isn't it wise to say that I don't know your fine Heavenly Father, but thank you for it, that you had a part in this? That would sure be wise.
Well, that would probably be wise, yes. But again, we don't really know for certain one way or the other on these matters, Carl.
Sometimes I think he lets us do for ourselves. He warns us not to associate with people that are evil or because of consequences.
There are certainly times in which God reaches that point where he allows someone to do something that's contrary to his will. I would use Romans 12th chapter more so than prodigal son, even though this prodigal son might apply to it. But how many times in Romans 1, starting in verse 18 and going through the end of the chapter, verse 32, does it state that God gave them up? Or God gave them over. Basically, I'm allowing them to do this. I think when we look back in the Old Testament, yes, that this chastening and all of the chastenings of the Lord that he dealt with Israel was for that redemptive purpose in bringing Christ into the world. And to keep a purity of bloodline, to put it that way. In other words, when they intermingled with nations, it destroyed that bloodline. And through Jason's preaching, we've noticed several of that. He's a direct descendant of this person, and this person, this person, and on it goes. If they intermingled with the nations, it destroys that. And so God kept them to themselves and told them, for example, going into the promised land, what were they to do? Destroy them, actually. You're right, they didn't do it. And it became a thorn in their side the rest of their existence because they did not obey God back there and when God said drive them out, to destroy them utterly. Carl. Well, that's the principle of sowing and reaping. Be not deceived. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. He that soweth to the flesh, of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall reap life everlasting. Galatians 5, verses 9 and 10. Galatians 6, verse 7 and 8. There are certain things which bring their own chastisement. The alcoholic brings his own chastisement from the alcohol itself and the destruction of the brain cells. And so smoking brings its own destruction with the emphysema and COPD and the lung cancer and all of the other types of cancer that comes along with it. It brings its own destruction. So yes, there are those things, but then God works through providential means, through natural means to bring about both His providence and His chastisements. And in these passages that we've noted, there in Job 5:17 and Psalm 94:12, both of them expressing, you're blessed from the chastening of the Lord, and to not despise it, to learn from it. So in verse 25, he adds, when he hath made plain the face thereof, doth he not cast abroad the fitches and scatter the cummin, and cast in the principal wheat and the appointed barley and rye in their place? So after breaking up the soil and preparing the soil, the farmer then sows the seed. But he does so according to a method. Have you ever seen a farmer who had absolutely no method in his planting the seed? If he's like that, he's not going to be too successful, is he? And you can hear them talking about, I'm going to plant this here, and I'm going to plant this here, and I'm going to plant. That's what he's talking about here. There's a method that he goes through. And by doing so, he's showing a care for and concern for the land and for his crops. The idea of made plain the face thereof. New King James has it, I think, leveled its surface. That's probably a better understanding than made plain the face thereof. We're not told here how he levels it, just that he does level it, and thus one of the ways was simply possibly a harrowing of it. That is, you get a heavy instrument that has teeth on it. Sometimes they would use branches, and they would drag it over the plowed land to break up the clods and to remove the weeds. And for all of that aspect of it, and also they would use something like that to cover the seeds. That would basically be disking today. And
So a disc and a harrow are like accomplish similar purposes?
they would accomplish similar purposes, yes. And breaking up once it's plowed, breaking it up, smoothing it out, getting it ready for the seed. There's always that pattern. There's a method to what he is doing. Fitches. It's also translated as anise. Anise, mint, and cumin. Now then, it is basically black cumin. It's a small black acritic seed.
What kind of seed?
Acritic, acid, tasting, seed that's used for seasoning. Cumin was a herb. Reason I'm laughing is I keep kidding Karen when we get to this, and I always call it herb with her, and so now that it just comes out accidentally. I know better, so if I call it herb, you'll know what I'm talking about, and I know better. But out of habit, it's become that. Right. They were very particular, and these are very small, insignificant herbs and seasonings that basically were not worth all that much. And the Pharisees were making, as Jesus condemns them in Matthew 23, you make sure that you get a tenth of that. You tithe those things. But when you get over here to grace, mercy, those type of things, you don't care about them. You have no concern about those things, but you make sure you get the money, the tithing. Does that sound familiar today? You got religions today that they don't care about anything as long as you send your tithe in. Of course, tithing is not something that is for the New Testament, period. We give as we've been prospered. But that's true. They will make sure they get that money because that's what they're interested in reality. And so you don't even have to come. Don't ever show up. Doesn't matter. As long as you send your tithe in, that's all that matters. You'll be a member in good standing if you send that tithe in. Doesn't matter how you live, whether you come or not. No.
Why they don't give a hoot about going by the New Testament pattern, because that distracts them from getting the money they want to get when they go by the pattern. I mean, their way of thinking like that.
You'll have to ask them. But it is similar to a lot of denominational groups today who that's what they care about. You get the televangelist in particular. And I still remember the one, and this was probably back in the 1970s, maybe 80s, but I think it's in the 70s still, who basically said, if you send him $1,000, you will put God in your debt. He will be obligated to give you whatever you want. Now then, think of what $1,000 was back then. That was a lot of money. A lot more than it is now. And still, we think $1,000 is a lot of money, don't we? Even today. But that's all he was concerned about. But that's just one illustration of just about all the televangelists, isn't it? All they care about is money. Well, that was the Pharisees. Make sure you get the tithe of mint, anise, and cumin. And that's why Jesus could say you've omitted the weightier matters of the law, mercy and grace and such. But cumin was a herb used in making bread in particular. Likewise, the wheat, barley, and rye, I think the American Standard and New King James has smelt, and the smelt in its place. That basically is rye, is what it's dealing with. They are planted in their appropriate places, as again determined by the farmer. Now then, the rye or the smelt was, according to Homer Haley, a kind of wild wheat or a kind of vetch used as camel fodder. Is planted as a border around the wheat and barley. We do not know why the smelt was planted as a border, but the farmers of Judah knew, and to them it made sense. I thought that was probably about as good a way of putting things as we could. They understood why they did it. Do I, or we today? No. But there must have been a reason, and that's the way they did it. They would plant it as a border. I don't know. It could have. We don't know. Plant that black cumin and but again, it wasn't something valuable. It was used as camel fodder, he says. Well, so why they planted it as a border? Don't know why. They knew. And who knows? Maybe someday we'll get smart enough to know why they did it, and we might start doing it.
So camels don't eat valuable stuff, in other words. I didn't know that.
This was something that they used in the fodder. It would not have been all that valuable. As really none of these things that he's mentioned, the wheat and barley, that would have been, but the fitches, the cumin or black cumin and cumin, that wasn't valuable. But the farmer planted them in the method in which he desired. to bring it to whatever he wanted. In verse 26, for God doth instruct him to discretion, and doth teach him, or for his God. The farmer acts in a wise manner because God instructs him and teaches him. How does God instruct him and teach him, though? Well, by man's knowledge of agriculture, which God has provided by or through the laws of nature, and man reasoning and observing them. Years ago, I had an assignment to write a manuscript on miraculous divine healing today. I started out with the point that all healings today are divine healings. Not miraculous, but divine healings. How? Because God has provided our knowledge and through the examination of scientific studies, both from the human body and other aspects, that doctors can learn those things. And through that, those laws which God has instituted, those principles that he has instituted, through their observance. And by the way, science is to a great extent observing things. Sometimes we mention the creation or evolution, which is the two choices that are in existence, that as far as the origin of the world, is not a matter of science. Science cannot deal with a matter of origins. It's an impossibility, because science is not and does not deal within the realm of something that is a one-time event, for example. For it to be science, it has to be observable. Who observed the origin? Other than God, no one. It has to be repeatable. It has to be able to be repeated time and time again. Is the origin of the world repeatable? Don't think so. So observable, repeatable, and falsifiable is another aspect. You have to be able to falsify it. Science can't deal with the origin of the world. But, yes. Right. Because they have observed it, and it is repeatable every time. Well, human body and dealing with the human body, same thing, same principles. And man has observed that, and thus through that observation, he has learned how to deal with it. Oh, I know, you can have surgery on this, and we can cut this out, or we can do this. Why? Because we've studied it and we've learned it. Guess what all that is? That's God's providence. It is a divine healing. So all healings are divine healings. Now, that doesn't mean miraculous healings. But God, through his providence, and that goes back years and years, even before our time, even before any of us were born. Some of you, that's a long, 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 long time ago. Now, I wouldn't say who, but somebody else. Long time before that, God was preparing for the healings that are taking place today. And it is a constant learning process. And thus, through that learning, though, God gave us the capability of learning those things. God gave us the capability of observing those things and learning, and thus being able to bring about this healing that we see today. So all healings are divine healings. They're just not miraculous healings. Okay, Dale, real quick.
I just came references on this one. You go to Daniel 12:4, and it says, people shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Same thing Timothy said. You train references in 1 Timothy 6. He goes on and on. I was filled with information about it.
We're going to continue increasing in knowledge. We will continue to increase in knowledge. Well, thus, how does God instruct and teach? Through providential means that we, through our observation, through learning the laws of nature, and all of the other things that go into it, we learn those things, and God is teaching us. So, God uses various means and devices, some harsher than others, but all of it, we're saying, especially talking about the Old Testament now, all of it to bring about His redemptive purpose in Christ. And God's judgments upon Judah will be successful, even though they might not have understood it, we might not understand it. They will be successful in fulfilling God's purposes. They might not have even understood God's purpose. Don't think they did, actually. We might not understand God's purposes today in something, but recognize God is at work. And God is fulfilling His purposes. So we'll stop there, and Lord willing, next week we will start in verse 27.